Olga had always thought the worst thing in life was working as a cleaner and not having the money to pay for her sick mother's treatment. She'd pictured the long shifts, the stained mop bucket, the hollow ache that never quite went away. She had imagined scraping by, borrowing, pleading, and then running out of time. So when billionaire Konstantin Petrov walked into her life with a single, terrifying proposition, "Marry me for 1 year, and I'll pay 5 million rubles," Olga realized that her problems were only beginning. What she did next shocked everyone. Before we begin, write in the comments which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. A morning that began like any other began to unspool into fate. The alarm at 5 a.m. was a small, merciless thing. Olga dragged herself from the narrow bed in a communal apartment, blinked away sleep in the cold bathroom, and took a quick shower under the thin, rattling pipe. The bathroom door banged behind her. She wrapped herself in her worn blue cleaning smock, a fabric badge of all the work she did to keep other people's lives shining, and shouldered the bucket and rag she'd carry on the subway. At 25, she'd learned how to make the world seem normal for other people while hers frayed at the edges. Her mother had been in the oncology ward for 3 months. The bills stacked up like an enemy. Each day cost another pill, another test, another whispered consultation with the doctor. Money began to leak from them, as if their small life were losing its hold. Olga adjusted the threadbare smock around her waist, straightened her back, and stepped into the gleaming hall of the North Crown, a skyscraper where men in suits and women in heels glided like a different species. The marble underfoot shone. The morning light glinted off polished surfaces. Her old sneakers squeaked faintly against perfection. "Volkova!" the security guard Petrovich barked, his voice cracking like a whip. To the director. Now. Her heart lurched. The director called people into his office for one reason: cuts. In the cramped room, director Semyon Kuzmich kept his head buried in paperwork, as if the rustle of forms could convince fate to change. He didn't run his eyes upward. "We're downsizing. This is your last shift. Payroll will issue your final pay." "Ow! My mother." Olga started, the plea raw in her throat. "She's in the hospital. I need this job. It's final. Sorry, Olya." The words were like a slammed door. Olga left the office with legs weak, as if someone had removed the floor from under her. 1,000 things swirled in her head: calls, loans, shame. In her pocket, the ancient phone buzzed, as if to mock her with its own small life. It was the oncology clinic. "Olga Andreevna, we need to talk about your mother," the voice said. An hour later, she sat under fluorescent lights in a white consultation room, while the doctor, steady, composed, gave the words that made the world tilt. "She needs surgery immediately. It's an advanced technique. The best surgeons are available, but it's expensive. $45,000, 3 million rubles. We have 2 weeks. After that, it may be too late." 3 million. Olga whispered the number to herself, as if saying it aloud might change its magnitude. 2 weeks. She would not earn that amount even in 10 years at the wages she received, pushing a mop through the same hallway she had just been fired from. By evening, she found herself pulled back to the towering facade of the North Crown, drawn there like a moth to a dangerous flame. The lobby was busy. Executives in tailored suits shuffled by, their days full of meetings and decisions. She sat on the bench by the fountain and took out her phone. Her fingers did not obey her brain. She could call friends, look for another job, but what she wanted most was some miracle. She asked a uniformed girl at the cafe by the lobby for a cup of hot tea. The server handed her a steaming cup, and for a few minutes the hot liquid steadied her shaking hands. And then he exited the elevator. He wore a navy suit cut with the kind of precision money could buy. He was tall, dark-haired, sharp-featured, an image that seemed to belong to magazine covers and boardrooms. He spoke on the phone, moving fast toward the exit, when Olga rose to let him pass. Her bag snagged her foot, the cup tilting. Hot tea sloshed onto the man's light shirt. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she cried, reaching for napkins and making the stain worse. He stopped and looked at her. His gray eyes were cool as stone. "Do you understand how much that shirt cost?" he asked. The voice was calm, threaded with annoyance. I'm terribly sorry. I'll pay for the cleaning. She could not stop apologizing. There was absurdly a badge on her smock with her name, Olga Volkova. Cleaning services. He bent his gaze to the name and said it slowly. Olga Volkova. Interesting. She felt her cheeks go cold. She had just poured tea on the owner of the building, on the man whose name rested on annual reports and company websites. Sir, I can pay for it. Please accept. He removed a business card from his jacket and handed it to her. Konstantin Petrov. See. Her breath left her in a gust. She had doused the man who owned the tower itself with tea. He seemed to find her naked panic intriguing rather than infuriating. Have you eaten tonight? He asked abruptly. No. Then come to the White Swan at 8. I have a proposition. Why? She wondered, staring after him as the black Mercedes waited outside. Why would the owner of the city's most exclusive corporation invite a cleaner to dinner? She smoothed the card with shaking fingers until the gold lettering blurred. That night, she put on the only decent dress she owned, a simple black frock she had bought 3 years earlier for university graduation. In the tiny mirror, she saw an ordinary young woman with light brown hair and wide green eyes. She had dreamed of different things, seeing the world, working with words, a life where she could afford to breathe a little. The White Swan perched at the top of a luxury hotel. Crystals hung from chandeliers. Waiters wore tuxedos. Every cloth was white and pristine. Olga couldn't imagine the world beyond the restaurant doors and slid into a chair with small, shaky hands. Konstantin already sat at a table by the window, a watchful silhouette against the city lights. Tonight he'd swapped his business suit for black evening wear. He looked a degree more untouchable. Sit, he said. Mr. Petrov, I don't understand, she stammered. Hungry, he asked, sliding a leather menu across. The numbers on it made her mouth go dry. Order whatever you wish. On me. She tried to refuse. His voice did not allow objection. She ordered a salad, and he ordered steak. They ate in an uneasy silence until he laid a white leather folder on the table and opened it. On the cover, in gold print, it declared, Marriage Contract. Olga stared. He pushed the contract toward her. Read. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. The paper was thick, the type precise. Marriage contract between Konstantin Andreevich Petrov and Olga Andreevna Volkova. Term, 1 calendar year, it said. The obligations listed were astonishing. Public appearances as his wife, attendance at business and philanthropic events, residence at his home when necessary. Compensation, 5 million rubles. Additional clauses, no romantic relationship, separate bedrooms, total confidentiality. Is this a joke? She asked, unable to keep the fear out of her voice. No, he folded his hands. I need a wife for a year. Formally. No feelings, no intimacy. Purely a business arrangement. For what purpose? She asked, bewildered. Both of us have reasons, he replied. You need money for your mother. I need a wife to handle certain social and business requirements. It's mutually beneficial. She stared at the figure, 5 million rubles. That was enough for the surgery, and then some. Why me? She asked. You move in circles where no one will suspect the marriage is a sham. Exactly, he said. You're not from my world. No one will suspect anything. Besides, I like you. His gray eyes scanned her. For the first time since she met him, those eyes felt like a mirror in which something unreadable shimmered. I need time to think. Tonight, he said. I'll leave on a business trip tomorrow. Sign if you agree. If not, you won't see me again. He laid a gold pen beside the contract. His hand was steady. Olga's hand shook as she reached for it. In her head, the repeating clock of her life beat. Mother in hospital, 3 million, 2 weeks, 1 year. After that, divorce, then freedom. She bent over the paper. Konstantin's voice softened. Olga, he said almost gently, sometimes in life you have to take a risk to save the one you love. Those words were the last defense line for hope. She signed. Excellent, he said, taking the contract. Tomorrow morning a car will pick you up. Bring only essentials. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Petrov. She left the restaurant numb, watching the Moscow light smear into streaks. In the back seat, his assistant, Andrew, checked the rear view. Everything is planned. Yes, replied Constantine softly. Yes, she signed. Olga sat in her small room that night, with the contract folded inside her mind like a foreign object. She had stepped through a door into a life she hadn't chosen and couldn't undo. The world she knew ended tonight. A new life, gilded and strange, waited. The golden cage. The black Mercedes arrived at 10 the next morning. Olga stood by her window with a small suitcase and watched the suited driver step down. Olga Andreevna, I'm from Mr. Petrov, the man said. She nodded, wordless. One day she had been a cleaner. The next she rode smoothly across the city. Briarcliff Heights, Petrov's estate, was larger than anything she'd ever seen. White columns, enormous windows, lawns cut like velvet. She stepped from the car and felt as if she'd been deposited into a different universe. The butler opened the heavy door, and a housekeeper named Nina Ivanovna greeted her, years in her eyes and a soft, efficient manner. "Welcome, madam," she said in a voice that had seen many comings and goings. "This is your room." She showed Olga to a bedroom trimmed in creams, a walk-in closet, a tub big enough to bathe in an ocean of steam. "This is all mine," Olga whispered when the door closed. Nina smiled. "It belongs to the owner," she corrected gently. "He lives in a separate wing. You will be living apart. Housework is handled by staff. Don't worry." The mansion was magnificent, but at its core, there was chill, the absence of laughter, of feminine noise. A grand piano gathered dust. A library smelled faintly of leather and forgotten stories. That first evening, Constantine returned from work. For the first time, she saw him without the armor of a corporate persona. He slid his jacket off and loosened his tie. At the table, he seemed human, less distant. "Dinner at 8, he said. "We will discuss rules." "Rules?" "Yes. Separate bedrooms. No intimacy. Only the appearance of a married couple in public." "Understood." She nodded, though something in her chest constricted at the thought. The idea of showing a happy facade while living in parallel solitude felt like being caged in gilded bars. He told her she would accompany him to social functions and philanthropic events. She would be trained to move through a world of etiquette and veneer. At the end of the night, he went to his study, and she went to her room to explore silence in a space that was massive and empty. She slid open a door and saw his office. Dark wood, leather chairs, a massive desk. On the desk was a framed photograph of him with a beautiful blonde in a white dress. Victoria, she later learned, the name written on a ribbon tucked in a drawer. Olga felt a small, inexplicable stab of jealousy. It was ridiculous. This was business. Still, a woman looks at a framed smile and cannot help but imagine a history she is not part of. Days passed in a haze of clothes fittings, etiquette lessons, pronouncements on posture, stylists and image consultants shaping her into a public wife. It was exhausting and intoxicating and alien. She learned to hold a champagne flute, to step in heels, to smile with a certain degree of teeth. And then came the gala, a charity evening at the Grand Theater. Cameras flashed. Reporters wanted a face to attach to the billionaire's arm. "Meet my wife, Olga," Constantine announced with the practiced ease of a public figure. He wrapped his hand around her waist for the cameras. The contact was simple, but it left a heat in her that had nothing to do with makeup or dress. Someone she barely knew had his hand on her back, and it felt unexpectedly tender. For one short instant, she believed in the lie. The night shifted when Victoria walked in, the same woman in the photo. She came in white and familiar, as if she had returned from a dream. She kissed Constantine's cheek with the intimacy of people who had shared beds and quiet mornings. He stiffened, the brittle machine of his carefully maintained life suddenly out of balance. "Constantine," she drew out his name as if testing a chord. "Victoria, this is my wife," he said. The name landed like a stone. Victoria forced a little smile. "Charmed," she said to Olga, her hand a cool plane. Later in the ladies' lounge, Victoria cornered Olga. Her smile was sharp. "Play your role well," she said, and then she poured the venom. "Do you think he married you out of love? He married me 3 years ago. He left me when he learned he was ill. I left because I was young and frightened. Now he is well, rich again. I came back. Olga felt the ground tilt beneath her. Victoria's accusation suggested that Olga was merely a theatrical prop, a curtain pulled across a more complicated heart. She fled into the night, and the orchestra's strings seemed to blur. Constantine found her near a column. He took her hand and led her to the balcony where the city shimmered below them. "Did she say something?" he asked softly. She confided each bitter word. He listened, and the fortress around him cracked. Under the pale stars, he took a breath and touched her cheek. The touch was unscripted, warm, private. "I don't know what I feel," he admitted, which was a confession and a question in one. For all is cool, something human stirred. The tension between the contract's terms and the rawness of their brief interactions pulled them toward confusion. He told her he wanted her to be his assistant. Proximity in daylight might make the arrangement feel more natural. She agreed, in part because the idea of a day spent alone in a grand house frightened her. Work at the North Crown Tower had rooms with panoramic windows and polished floors. Olga sat at a desk near the glass and attempted to process spreadsheets and schedules. But the older she looked, the more she tried to concentrate, the more her eyes drifted to Constantine, the man who could switch from the corporate titan to a vulnerable patient in one heartbeat. He left for meetings, signed documents, and the office felt like a theater set for a life she'd been thrust into. Then she found the envelope. A plain manila envelope with a hospital's stamp had slipped onto a stack of papers and spilled its contents across her desk unnoticed. Olga's curiosity, dangerous and human, made her glance at the loose sheet that fluttered where the papers lay. The words made her blood run cold. Glioblastoma. Stage 4. Prognosis: poor. She hadn't meant to pry, but fate has a way of throwing a person into knowledge they cannot unlearn. Constantine caught her glancing at the papers, and the color leached from his face. "Those are private," he said, the calm breaking into a brittle state. "Return them. Don't touch things that aren't yours." He was furious, but the secret was in the air now. A few days later, during a presentation to German investors, he stopped mid-sentence. A spear of pain shot across his face. He clutched his head and collapsed. "Call an ambulance," someone screamed. Olga, stunned, was by his side before anyone else, cradling his head as if instinct had always guided her hands. In the hospital's harsh light, the truth broke open. The tumor was aggressive. His seizures would recur. Dr. Sokolov, a surgeon with gray hair and a weary face, told her the truth bluntly. There was an experimental operation that might remove the growth, but the risk was high, half chance. With no surgery, his life could be reduced to months, perhaps weeks. When Constantine woke in his hospital bed, he did not seem to understand the shape of his life. "Who are you?" he asked, blinked slow. "I'm your wife," she said quietly. She'd learned how to say the phrase before the contract. He blinked, puzzled. "We were married 8 months ago." He did not remember. The surgery had saved him, but the operation had affected areas of the brain responsible for recent memories. Dr. Sokolov told her with a surgeon's directness. He remembers his childhood, his education, his business. The most recent year, that time with you, may be gone. It may return, or it may not. She sat in the corridor with all the small acts of being human washed away into a long ache. He was alive, but the one she now loved, who she had signed for money and duty, may not remember the nights she had held vigil, the way she'd stayed awake to count his breaths. Once he began to read his own journal, a strange thing happened. Words he had written in a moment of fear and affection began to stitch across the blank space. He read aloud a passage where he'd watched her in the kitchen and felt something tender. He read the entry written the night before surgery, where he'd scribbled the terror that he might forget the face that had become important to him. The pages trembled with his own voice, and for an instant recognition shivered through his eyes. They tried, together, to remember what had been, to make memory a practice rather than an accident. The push and the pull. Recovery was a long and uneven road. A few memories came back. Others remained stubbornly blank. Olga told him stories, showed photographs from the gala, the quiet domestic images of a life that had been lived. The kitchen where she'd burned the first attempt at a steak, the winter night on the balcony, the crimson-coated parka carelessly thrown over a chair. At times he would smile with a shadow of recognition. At times he would be as distant as a man reading a script of someone else's life. 4 months after the operation, on the last day of the contract, he carried a white folder into the breakfast room. "We need to talk," he said, and inside was a check, 5 million rubles, and the practical completion of the arrangement. Money done. Contract fulfilled. Olga looked at the paper and felt a bitter, complicated flutter. The sum that had once saved her mother now seemed like a theater prop. She tore the check piece by piece. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want you, but I can't give you what you want on command." Constantine argued reasoned points. She could find a man to make her a family, to give children, to make a life free of the instability she'd known. He insisted he was doing the sensible, kind thing. He paused, and then the air shifted. He found a stolen memory, a kiss in the conservatory, the night vacuumed by suspicion when he'd almost kissed her but had hung back, the time he'd found himself jealous of another man who danced with her. The remembered spark startled him like sunlight on water. "Did you ever love me?" she demanded, vulnerable now. His eyes filled, not with corporate calculation, but something raw. "I do," he said. "I do. Even when I could not recall, my heart did." But timing is a cruel force. In the months she had given to loving and reminding him, she had felt like a stranger in her own life. A woman proving her worth each day, like an applicant re-interviewing for a job at the altar. The accumulation of those small indignities had a weight. She had given all the proofs, and the proofs had dragged her under. She packed a suitcase and walked out. The taxi took her away and closed the door on a chapter that had not yet healed. For a time, Constantine stood with the torn letter in his pocket, the confession he'd meant to give her in the hospital, and he tore it slowly to shreds. He had discovered too late that words are useless when time and tenderness are necessary. Months later, a quiet knock sounded at a modest one-room apartment, where she lived now among scraped chairs and the smell of boiled tea. She was translating English documents for meager pay. Her mother had recovered and rested in a rehabilitation center outside the city. The knock made her heart skip. There he was, thin, softened, less of the titan and more of the man she'd once warmed. Constantine stood on the stairwell with a white folder. He had changed his appearance. The dark suit's gone, a sweater and jeans now. "May I come in?" he asked. He sat at her chipped kitchen table and placed a single sheet of paper before her. On the page, written in his hand, was one line, "Love me for the rest of my life." Signed and dated. He opened a small ring box and got down on one knee on the linoleum floor. "Olga Andreevna Volkova," he said, voice raw. "Marry me. Not for a contract, not for convenience, but for love." She looked at him, at the ring, at the humility in his weathered hands. He told her he had sold the company, the thing that used to be his life. Money and empire meant nothing if it cost him the one person who had quietly become essential to him. Her simple answer was the one he had feared and hoped for. Yes. They married properly a year later in a small country church. Vows, rings, a few loved ones. The world seemed ordinary now, and yet everything felt new. In his jacket pocket, he kept a small scrap of paper with those words he once offered as a business agreement. Now it was the end of an arc, a promise sealed by 2 lies made by choice rather than necessity. Love, it seemed, had its own strange economy. It could be bought for a price, but could not be owned. It could be nurtured by patience and truth, and terror could be spun into tenderness. Olga and Constantine's story began with a contract and ended with vows because people, fragile, stubborn, keep choosing each other. When Olga closed the front door of the little apartment and sat at the wobbly kitchen table, she felt the quiet like an ocean pressing against the edges of everything she had known. There were 2 mugs in the sink, one chipped, one with a faint floral pattern that her mother had given her. She had scrubbed floors in palaces and dusted chandeliers. Now she scrubbed the plates of her own life until they shone and placed them back in the cabinet. Months had passed since the last day in the mansion, since the torn check and the silence of a man who could not always remember which heart had kept him alive. The winter had receded, The first timid shoots of spring had pushed through cracked sidewalks. Her mother had recovered enough to be transferred to a sanatorium, where she caught up on sleep and regained color in her cheeks. Olga used the freelance translations to keep the modest bills paid. She had learned to live on less and to count small mercies with both hands. In the slow evenings, she would fold the day's labor into a drawer and sift through memory like it was a box of old letters. Sometimes she read the journal entries Constantine had written and aloud to herself, as if the cadence of his handwriting might restore a lost sound. The way he had once practiced saying Olga until it stopped sounding like a foreign syllable and became a name. She sometimes wondered whether what she loved was the man or the idea of the man who had been saving her mother. She tried not to interrogate herself too much. Such investigations had a way of shattering the fragile self that remained. Then the knock came. He stood on the landing like an apparition. He looked thinner, as if the shadows of hospital corridors had taken something from him. His suit had been replaced by a well-worn sweater and jeans. For the first time, the armor of wealth had been traded for ordinary cloth. He carried a single folder, white and clean against the grime of the stairwell. His eyes were still that gray that had made her knees weak the first time she'd met them, but in them lived something softer now. Regret, perhaps, or humility. "May I come in?" he asked, in a small voice that almost matched the squeak of the building stairs. She stepped aside. When he sat at her table, he seemed nervous in a way that no multimillionaire had a right to be. He fumbled with the folder, then extracted a single sheet of paper. On it, in handwriting that trembled a little, was a short sentence: "Love me for the rest of my life." Below it, his name and the date. He then opened a tiny box and took from it a simple gold ring. "All the trophies," he said, "lost their meaning. I sold the company. I sold the symbol of what I thought made me safe. And I came here because I have nothing left to sell but the truth of what I feel." Olga felt the world shift, as if some huge weight, a kind of social gravity, had lessened its pull for a brief moment and allowed two people to float closer. She saw, in the way his hands trembled, the long months of being terrified, the nights spent awake in hospital wards, the private reckonings he must have had with himself. She saw someone whose decisions had been occasionally cruel, but who had finally been humbled enough to ask for what had always been his to ask. She thought of all that the contract had asked her to do: to perform love, to stand as a fiction when the real thing would have been rude or premature. She thought of how many small daily loyalties she'd had to perform: brushing a boot, listening to a weary voice on the phone, learning to walk in shoes that never belonged to her. She thought of her mother learning to walk again in the sanatorium courtyard, the little victories that now mattered. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a river breaking through ice. They married in the small country church that smelled of wax and cheap flowers. The congregation was an odd mixture of people who had sat in the privileged tiers and those who had a more modest loyalty, Nina Ivanovna among them, the housekeeper who had tended china and secrets in a mansion of breathless rooms, and the translator who had learned, slowly, to stitch two lives together with ordinary things like grocery lists and the smell of bread. After the wedding, life had to settle into itself slowly. They had both been shaped by different economies. He by markets and board meetings, she by hourly wages and palliative gestures. The collision of those worlds required patience, a language of small courtesies. He learned to appreciate a pot of stew as a domestic art. She learned to read documents not as instruments of power, but as conversations with his mind. They found tiny pleasures in one another that had nothing to do with spectacle. A cup of tea at dawn, a walk down a narrow lane to buy stale bread from a baker who knew them by name, the surprise of small, cooked fish laid out on a Sunday table. To understand why a woman like Olga had signed a contract would be to consider how desperation distorts geometry. Her formative years had been not dramatic, but small and steady. A provincial town with a one-bus stop, a father who died when she was 15, a mother who had once sung lullabies while washing dishes. She had dreamed of languages, of travel, of maps with names she could not yet pronounce. She had studied economics because someone had told her it was practical. She had finished the degree and then found, like many, that credentials could sometimes be folded into envelopes and not used. When you're 25 and a loved one sits in a hospital bed and your pockets are empty, the world becomes a ledger where kindness is priced and the only currency that matters is cash. Constantine's offer came at that moment like a rope thrown to a drowning person. She was ashamed of taking it and ashamed of refusing it equally. She made complicated moral calculations, weighed the love for her mother against the cost of parading in a gilded cage, and signed. That signature was not the end of her agency. It was a reconfiguration of it, a decision made under duress that would, paradoxically, reveal things about herself and others that she had not known. Constantine's early life was a study in the creation of a mask. He had been raised in a house where silence was a value and achievement a law. Early success had taught him that power was most reliable when it was measured in numbers. When the diagnosis came, it cracked something rigid in him. The exodus of Victoria was both a wound and an accusation. She left him when she thought his future thinned to a sliver. The world judged him, and so did his privacy. The social bone of his life, built of invitations and philanthropy, needed a woman to stand beside him. He thought a contract would be the safest way to manage the risk of caring. Contracts, in his universe, insured against hurt. That belief, that love could be legislated away, was the crux of his error. Their first weeks as a married couple were a study in counterpoint. People assumed that money solves everything, but it only translates problems into different languages. In the mansion, Olga learned to navigate media events and charity dinners, to smile when cameras clicked, to rehearse stories about where she had grown up and how she and her husband had fallen in love. She learned compliments that echoed like tin plates and understood how to turn the choreography of public life into a dance without misstep. In the quiet room where his business files lay, she found more than one heirloom of hurt. There were photographs of Victoria with a smile like summer. There were letters he had written but never sent. She read, in the margins, scribbles where his hand had not been able to stop confessing how fear had made him withdraw. There were nights when she would read those pages to him in the hospital as he slept and hope that the sound of his own words might thread the broken memory back into place. Hospitals are strange theaters where time is both compressed and stretched. 8 hours of operation can feel like a whole season. Minutes of waiting can become a study in minutiae. Olga learned what silence tasted like in that setting. The antiseptic tang in the air, the beep of machines, the paper-thin scrubs around her shoulders. The operation itself was both miracle and theft. It removed a tumor that threatened to steal life, but in cutting the mass out it upset the neural map of recent days. Some maps are less resilient than others. The surgeons were honest. Memory could come back in fragments, like a mosaic reconstructed, but there was no guarantee. For a patient like Constantine, whose life had been built so definitively, the loss of the last year could feel like erasing a small vital chapter. Olga's vigil in the hospital chair came to define her. She learned how the small actions, holding a hand, smoothing a brow, telling an old joke, could be anchors. She learned to be steady when the doctors were brisk and technical. She learned to love in the presence of the possible, the possibility of loss. There were days when the petition of his recovery looked bleak, seizures in meetings, a head bowed to pain, the body that once defined power humbled by biology. But there were also tiny returns, a laugh at a small joke, the recognition of a favorite book, an instantaneous tenderness displayed when he looked at her in the middle of the night and asked, wordlessly, "Are you still here?" Love, in their case, did not bloom like a tidy flower. It was messy, tentative, sometimes furious. Doubts banged against the sides of the heart as if intent on testing the furnaces. Constantine had to contend with the shame of forgetting and the guilt of being forgiven. Olga had to contend with the fatigue of reteaching memory and the stubborn ache of proving yourself over and over. The world around them, reporters, friends, the memory of Victoria, dipped into their narrative like an audience that wanted a neat finale. They negotiated new boundaries. There were arguments, long ones, about money and values. Olga had been raised to make do. Constantine had been raised to command. He had once thought philanthropy a diversion from the real business of profit. She had thought money a means to rescue those who were unwell. They had to teach each other to be generous in different ways. His decision to sell his company was not merely romantic theater. It was a consequence of the internal transformation he had to undergo. At first, he told himself he sold it to prove his seriousness. Then, as the dust settled, he found that freedom from a tyrannical schedule allowed him to be present in the small things. He found a hand convenient, but now irreplaceable. He discovered that an afternoon to breathe with the person he loved was more valuable than the grandest evening. Memory is an odd tide. Sometimes it withdraws, and at other times it reveals what has been hidden beneath the sand. Constantine's pieces came back in shards and images. It was not linear. He would remember a laugh and not the laugh source. He would recall the feel of a chair's leather and not where it stood. Sometimes in the middle of dinner a recollection would emerge, the worst thing and the gentlest thing at once. And he would sit stunned, like a man remembering a language he once spoke. It was a slow process and required ritual. Olga and he developed tiny daily routines aimed at reconstructing a life. Albums of photographs organized in a particular way. Evenings when they cooked a dish and wrote down the memory that dish summoned. Long walks through neighborhoods that had once seemed foreign but gradually yielded to familiarity. It was as if they were building a new scaffolding for his heart to climb. And so, because the human heart is oddly recalcitrant and easily taught, it learned some things anew. Constantine retasted the sensation of seeing her in the greenhouse and the night he had been tempted to kiss but had withheld himself. He remembered, as if by pocketing a phrase in sleep, how she had held his head in her hands the night of his worst seizure and not left. He rewrote the edges of his memory with the punctuation of experience, the bedside vigil, the paper-thin gestures of care. But memory did not return because of will alone. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing. Then a single image would fall in a place and a cascade of others would follow. He would read his own journal, the one she had found, and see the man who had been frightened enough to write his heart down. It was like having an outside witness confirm the existence of a remembered life. There were people who criticized their story, modern moralists who said that a contract to simulate marriage was a cynical commodification of intimacy. There were those who whispered that she had sold herself, and those who said he had purchased a conscience. The press loved a tidy scandal, a billionaire, a contract, a young cleaner, a narrative that felt at once ancient and newly modern. The internet proliferated jokes and think pieces. Their private sorrow became public consumption. They navigated that with a new kind of courage. Rather than explain, they lived. Rather than apologize, they built a life that contradicted the worst headlines. He devoted himself to concrete acts of repair, not just to her, but to himself. He paid attention to those small, necessary niceties, listening, learning, and, most importantly, refusing to return to habits that had once defined his arrogance. She, for her part, refused to allow shame to settle permanently on her shoulders. She had made a pragmatic choice under duress. She had married to save a life. That choice had become complicated by human tenderness. She refused to be reduced to a cautionary tale and instead insisted upon agency. She chose to love in full view, with the memory of every compromise like a ledger she had turned into a story of survival. Years later, when you looked at the domestic life that developed, it felt almost ordinary in its rhythms. They had a small garden that he loved to tend. It was a tangle of bulbs and vegetables rather than a manicured estate garden. They hosted neighbors for occasional dinner. They practiced the art of listening. Constantine learned how to cook a humble soup and to laugh at a burnt crust. Olga developed a practice of writing late at night, filling journals with things she wanted to say should memory fail again. They had arguments about the placement of towels and who forgot to buy milk, the small markers of a life made together rather than a life purchased. They also had moments of deeper reflection. They would sometimes walk to a bench by the small river that ran near their apartment and talk about the price of things. "Do you regret?" he would ask sometimes in the half-light. She would look at him and think of the exact answer. If I had known what would happen, would I have done it? She would ask the air, mostly to herself. If I had not been ill, he sometimes said softly, would I have learned what I needed to learn? They both knew the truth. The route they had taken was crooked and full of compromises. It was not a morality play where one rescues and one is rescued. It was a negotiation between courage and fear, a series of risks taken because the alternative, passivity, had been worse. They had both been human in the most stubborn ways. On a cold evening many years after the original contract, though time had rushed on and left softer things in its wake, they found themselves in a small country church where their real wedding had been performed. A small child tugged at Olga's dress. A friend from the old house served as a witness, smiling with a memory that surely felt larger than both of them combined. The exchange of vows was not public spectacle now, but a private renewal of an understanding. He still carried in his pocket the small scrap of paper from the day they first married, the professional contract that had bought them a year. He kept it not as a talisman, but as a reminder of the strange way life pushes two people into each other. He had learned to see the past, not as a ledger to be forgiven, but as a map to be read. The margins contained the very things that transformed them: the nights of vigil, the hospital lights, the days of small courtesies. On a winter evening as snow began to fall, they stood in the little courtyard of their apartment building, and he kissed her under the softly falling flakes. It was not for cameras and not for contracts. It was just two people with warm hands and the kind of quiet gratitude that comes from knowing the other will be there when the storms come. "Will you stay?" he asked, not as a man asking to be secured, but as a person asking for the mutual investment of life. "I will," she said. He put the ring on her finger again, not as original proof of a proposal, but as a small circle of commitment. He held her, and in that embrace the years condensed into a single breath. The terrible contract of desperation, the life-saving surgery, the slow return of memory, the selling of an empire, the small dinners and the burned bread, the child's laughter, the quiet apologies and the daily acts of tending. There are different economies in the world. This one, the economy of forgiveness, of courage, of ordinary acts of care, proved then, and in the years that followed, to be unmatchable. It did not erase the difficult choices they had made. Instead, it reframed them, not as purchases or debts, but as investments in a life that required both of them to keep faith. If there is a moral to the story, it is not a simple one. Life is rarely a moral parable with a single lesson tied neatly in a bow. Instead, it is a messy ledger of necessity, accident, luck, and the choices we make when there seems to be no choice at all. Olga's decision was born of desperation. Konstantin's choices were born of fear. But in the overlap of those lives, something genuine grew. It is a testament, perhaps, to human creativity and resilience that love can begin as a contract and become a covenant. People asked them, later, how they could reconcile the beginning with the end. "We learned," Olga would say, "we learned to make a life worth living." Konstantin, when he spoke of the past, sometimes used the metaphor of a building. "I built walls because I thought they would keep me safe," he said once, staring at the small flame in the kitchen stove. But walls also stop warmth. The house you end up inhabiting is the one you learn to sit in together. They were not saints. They were not paragons of virtue. They were two people who confronted their failures, made choices under pressure, and decided to love each other anyway. That, in the end, was what made the contract, and what came after, both terrible and strangely redeeming. Victoria Lebedeva was not a villain in the old-fashioned, theatrical sense. She was young once, pragmatic and frightened in an instant when the future she had imagined narrowed to a single fearful corridor. Her family was well-placed, money, a network of people who knew how to host dinners and hand out invitations, and she had believed, as many young people do, that love would live in the same economy as social standing. When Konstantin told her of the diagnosis, she thought she was protecting herself. She left the hospital room in the small hours, suitcase in hand, the choice made like an emergency exit. When she came back 3 years later, she was not the same frightened girl. She was better dressed, older in ways that fit into the seat of titled events. She had learned, as everyone learns, how to dress pain into a story and make it look like purpose. She claimed her love had never faded. In some ways, that was true. Her sense of betrayal had a double edge. She felt abandoned because he was sick and vulnerable, and she felt ashamed of her own departure because it revealed a small, raw truth about herself. Returning was less about greed and more about wanting to correct the record. She wanted the man she had once loved to see the woman she had become, and perhaps to be loved again. Victoria's reappearance in the mansion was calculated. She had friends in philanthropic circles. She knew the rhythm of the charity galas. She arranged a meeting with Constantine in a way that made it public enough to be noticed, but private enough to be intimate. Her tactics had been criticized in the tabloids as opportunistic. She had read the headlines. But to her, the return was an emotional audit. She wanted to assess whether the man she had once loved had changed, and whether she could live with the changes. When she saw Olga at the gala, she felt an unexpected contraction in her chest. Olga was not glamorous in the way Victoria had once been, but she carried an unexpected authenticity. There was a tension, a collision of worlds, that made Victoria, for a moment, question if she had been wrong about cowardice being survival. She could be cruel to Olga because cruelty protected a fragile pride. She could also be gentle if she admitted that she had fled instead of staying. On the balcony, when she told Constantine that she was back, it was part confession, part plea. He stood among orchids and winter lights and told her, with a voice that had found patience through pain, that he was confused. For the first time in years, he had to navigate not just illness, but the morality of love. Victoria left the mansion that night with more than she had come for. She had the knowledge that the person she had abandoned might be slipping away, not to death, but to someone who had come to him for reasons other than advantage. That was a bitter kind of loss. She had to reckon with the possibility that her courage at leaving had been cowardly after all. Nina Ivanovna was an institutional memory of the house on Rubliavka. She had been there longer than most of the furniture. Her hair was a soft silver twist. Her eyes were kind and practiced. People assumed housekeepers were invisible. Nina had been invisible once, too, until she learned that the small acts of noticing were the scaffolding of dignity. She had grown up in a provincial village, like many of the staff who kept huge houses functioning, and she had worked her way into service because steady work had a kind of quiet heroism to it. She was the person who ironed confessions into collars and read the expression on faces like a ledger. When she met Olga, she felt the same conflicted compassion she felt for a stray cat, caution mixed with the impulse to provide warmth. Nina had watched Constantine's life crack when Victoria left him, and she had observed the man's slow descent into a sort of shadow. He had retreated into work when he had reasoning to retreat into. Nina had seen what illness had done to him. She also understood why he would not risk his heart again. Thus, when Olga arrived, Nina treated her with the subtlety of someone who knows the house's moral temperature. She was courteous, protective, and quietly honest. She also harbored her own small tragedies, a son who lived far, a row of old friends who had died, a loyalty to the idea of a home. She felt deeply about laughter in the house and sighed when it was missing. Nina's contribution to their lives was far beyond dusting and meal plans. She was a keeper of the everyday, and in the hospital nights, she came with warm pajamas and remembered soup. When the gossip of the lawyers and tabloids turned into a roar, she slammed a tray down on the kitchen table and insisted on normality. In a life that had been performed for the cameras, Nina preserved the small rituals that allowed people to exist privately. Andrew, the assistant, had been hired young. He had learned the manners of a corporate household, when to answer a telephone, how to interpret a sigh. He had been a sort of nervous compass for Constantine, practical, attentive, and in the way of many assistants, a person who both admired and resented his employer. In the beginning, he had been a simple administrator. Over time, he became something like a steward of secrets. When Olga arrived, Andrew observed her with professional interest. She was not like the polished women who had rotated in and out of the house for company events. She was neither calculating nor ambitious in ways that mattered to the corporate ecosystem. Andrew's loyalty was complex, to his job, to the man who had given him a career, to human decency. He felt uneasy about the confidentiality of the contract. There were legalities to be navigated, permissions to be secured. But he admired Olga's bravery in ways he would never say aloud. When Konstantin fell ill, Andrew's professional role blurred into something more human. He sat in waiting rooms, made calls to the surgeons, and loved the man more from a place of devotion than romance. He learned to be a mediator between the public demands of the office and the private fracturing happening behind the house doors. When Konstantin sold the company, Andrew faced unemployment and confusion. But he also felt relieved because the man he had served no longer needed an army of people bending under the weight of performances. Andrew went on, as many assistants do, to find the next job. But he carried with him the oddly satisfying sense that the life he had watched had learned something fundamental. In the modern world, a private decision rarely stays private. Once the contract leaked, and things like that tend to leak from careless men and noisier lawyers, the press had a feast. Headlines wrote themselves: billionaires marriage for hire, cleaner marries mogul for millions, moral outrage in the age of money. Columnists debated the ethics of transactions disguised as love. Social networks exploded with commentary, some vicious, some sympathetic. People projected their fears about class and power onto the story, and the story became an axis for larger cultural debates. Konstantin's PR team moved quickly, as PR teams do. They issued statements, held controlled appearances, and tried to steer the narrative toward philanthropy and personal tragedy. Lawyers drafted disclaimers and confidentiality clauses. The company's board convened emergency sessions. Accounts were made. Konstantin, who had once calculated market risk in a ledger, now watched what he had orchestrated ripple in a way that no spreadsheet could quantify. Olga felt the media like a cold wind. She had not expected to be a public person. She had expected a short arrangement, money, survival. Suddenly strangers judged her life. They invented motivations for her that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with spectacle. She learned later that the story was a litmus test for many people. It allowed them to yell about inequality with the righteous certainty of their breakfast. But she learned, too, that truth has a weight of its own. Her truth was stubbornly simple and layered. She had saved her mother's life. She had made a deal as a last resort. She had tried to be honest and found honesty complicated. The lawyers insisted that confidentiality be enforced. There were clauses about non-disparagement, public statements, and the mechanics of payment. The contract had been legally plausible. It had been executed properly. But legality did not equal morality in public view. The debate raged. Yet as the days passed, the tide of scandal receded because private complexity often bleeds public outrage dry. People move on. Scandals are like weather, loud then gone. The operation itself became, in later retellings, a crucible. It was the scene that split the life in two, before the surgery, which brought his life back, and after, where memory was a negotiation rather than a guarantee. I'll walk through that night with more detail now, not to sensationalize, but to render what was lived. Pre-op. The waiting room had fluorescent lights and high-back chairs. The surgery was scheduled for early morning. Olga arrived with a notebook in which she had scribbled possible phrases to read to him after the operation. She held his hand as he was wheeled away. The surgeon, Dr. Sokolov, briefed them. The tumor was deep and close to areas associated with short-term memory. Removal was possible, but risky. 8 hours later, the operating theater doors opened. The surgeon emerged, his scrub stained, eyes tired but resolute. "The tumor is out," he said, "but we had to remove tissue adjacent to memory centers. He's breathing on his own. We cannot promise the recovery of recent memory. We can promise we did our best." Olga clung to that, till we did our best. The night stretched into an anxious vigil. She held his hand. She read to him from the books of his childhood, from pages where he had written his fears. She read the silly passages, the ones that made him laugh before the surgery, hoping to reattach his memory to the sound of his own life. Nurses came and went with gentle efficiency. Sleep was a frivolity she could not afford. She let her body go slack in the plastic chair and then woke with a thought like a sharp stone. Did she sleep? She had been sleeping on his hand, in bursts between panicked check-ins by nurses. When he opened his eyes, the first days were tender and raw. He looked at her with the slow, cautious curiosity of someone encountering a life story he could not yet fit into memory. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Olga," she replied. "Your wife." He did not remember. The words landed in him like translations of a foreign phrase. The doctors were blunt. "The last year may be gone," they said. "We do not know if it will return. Short-term memory may remain impaired." That uncertainty, which was a space of terror, became a zone of work. He would sometimes sit up at night, grip her hand, and whisper, "Tell me the story again." She told it, and in telling it, she re-owned it. For him, the reading of his own life was therapy and gift. For her, the telling was reclamation. What followed the operation was a version of courting that belonged to neither neat romance nor dull routine. It was a day-by-day practice in memory and intimacy. They had to invent together the rituals that would restore what had been lost. Instead of grand gestures, they chose repetition. He would wake, and she would lay out photographs. "Here, see, this is the gala," she'd say, opening a glossy page to a smiling image. They'd watch home videos and pause at moments where his expression betrayed recognition. He would read aloud the lines of his own diaries, the ones he had kept before operation, and watch his future reassemble like a jigsaw puzzle he'd once put away. They began to court in the old-fashioned sense, small, earnest, particular. He would meet her at the bus stop at dawn and bring a newspaper and a single croissant. They would walk through the market and buy a cabbage together, laugh at the oddness of two rich and poor crossing in the same space. He learned, slowly, the domestic art of listening. She learned to soften the armor of constant readiness, to accept his imperfect recollection without making it into a performance. Love grew in the small hours, in the mundane negotiations of groceries and soap. He learned to apologize often. She learned not to demand immediate signified proof. They both learned to imagine a life that required tenderness rather than insurance. Their public wedding had been quiet and small, because after all the spectacle, there was a deliberate move inward. It was not a party for the city. It was a private promise. The preparations felt different this time because they were not rehearsing for cameras. The bridesmaid was Nina Ivanovna, her hair done simply, stoic and tender. The groom's best man was a longtime friend who had no interest in public spectacle. They wrote their vows by hand, in a small kitchen at 3 in the morning. He apologized in a way that had nothing to do with grand purchases. She promised to be patient, to not demand the impossible, to trust memory and practice in equal measure. The wedding images were modest, but wholly theirs. Two people who had been through eras of theatrical risk and landed in the private geography of one another's hands. 5 years after their small church wedding, life had settled into a texture of small comforts and quiet makeshift rituals. They had a child, a small, noisy, unplanned flame of laughter that made stubborn things like sleep deprivation and bills feel like symmetrical parts of the same miracle. He taught the child to whittle a stick and to ask politely for extra berries. She taught the child to make paper boats. Constantine cultivated a life that was less a castle for him and more a house for many. He founded a small charitable organization for patients who had nowhere to turn, a practical outlet that allowed him to translate his resources into something more humane. He stayed out of the corporate sprint. He found satisfaction in the slow churn of making one thing reliable. He had not returned to the summit of the business world, but he had returned to something steadier, presence. Olga continued to ply her talents with language. Her translations improved. Her voice in small circles became valued. She had learned the stress of fame and the lighter pleasures of small earnings. She understood money as necessary, but not omnipotent. She had become public enough to have an opinion in a local magazine, and private enough to find great happiness in the smell of her child's hair in the morning. They had arguments about money, mundane ones about whether to spend on a holiday or to replace the roof. They had disagreements about which neighbor to trust, about whether their son would go to a city school or a small one in the country. They weathered the slow erosion of memory together. Small lapses that no longer felt like disasters because they had learned to translate them into stories and to laugh at what life forgot. What made their story remarkable to some was not that it ended happily, but that it became something like a cautionary renewal. The contract had been a desperate act from both sides. She desperate to save a mother's life, he desperate to manage the future with a shield. Their renewed lives were not a vindication of contracts. Instead, they were a proof that human beings can remake alliances when they admit their errors. Victoria, too, found her way. She founded a small consulting firm that helped young philanthropists run their charities. She did not seek to engulf Olga's life again. She married a distant professor after a long courtship. She visited the mansion rarely and lived with the uncomfortable knowledge that she had made a choice once that had become a teacher to her. Andrew moved overseas, a quiet professional with a taste for small towns. Nina Ivanovna retired, returning to the village she had left long ago and planting roses by her gate. The threads of their lives were broader than those initial headlines had allowed. If you look back on the sequence of events critically, you might say the story is messy. You might say it reveals the ugly ways in which money can shape intimacy. Those are fair claims. The story is about the weight of choices made under pressure, about the way people miscalculate, about the long labor of repairing what has been damaged by fear. But it is also about the stubbornness of small acts, the daily retellings, the hospital vigils, the patience that teaches habits of faith. The final scenes of their life are not cinematic in the way that the tabloids once imagined. They are ordinary. He makes coffee poorly, but always remembers to stir without sugar for her. She writes letters to her child and pins them to the refrigerator. They quarrel like any couple and make up over burnt bread. They read each other, sometimes as if relearning a language, sometimes with the ease of those who have shared the long grind of years. In the end, the contract that once read like a joke becomes a relic carried in a pocket, a reminder that the origin of something need not determine its outcome. The story resists tidy moralizing because life rarely gives one.